All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Today we're going, well, it's going to get pretty intense.
Oh yeah.
Edward George McGregor.
I've heard of this one. This is a long one,
Yeah,
right?
and we've only got his Wikipedia page to work with, but even that,
Oh, believe me, that's plenty.
it's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, you'll see. It goes way beyond just the crimes themselves. We're gonna have to get into how this whole thing was investigated, and even after the trial, there are so many questions still hanging out there.
Exactly. So we're not just going to, lay out what happened, but really try and figure out why it took so long to even figure out what was going on. I mean, what does this case tell us about the challenges that investigators face and the role of DNA evidence, all that?
We're also gonna see how the legal system itself can be a bit of a maze, right? How even when you get a verdict, sometimes the truth still feels, well, kind of out of reach.
Okay, so set the scene for us. It's 1990, Missouri City, Texas, late at night, quiet neighborhood. All of a sudden, this terrifying 911 call comes in. It's from a 38-year-old woman named Kim Wildman. You can hear the panic in her voice. She's saying she's been stabbed multiple times, but then silence.
Chilling.
Yeah. So police get to her house, and what do they find?
Kim Wildman dead on her kitchen floor, brutally murdered. Gruesome scene, you know?
And now, here's where it gets interesting. One of the first people they look at is a 17-year-old neighbor. Lived just 2 houses down from the victim, Edward McGregor.
Okay, so right away they're thinking, could this be it?
Yeah, but he says he had nothing to do with it. And back then, they just didn't have enough to connect him to the crime. So the case goes cold. And McGregor, he just keeps living in that neighborhood, steps from where it all happened.
It's like, wow, can someone really just live a normal life with something like that maybe hanging over them?
Yeah, it's a lot to process, but this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. We're talking the cases spans like over 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so early 90s, the Wildman case is still unsolved. Big question mark hanging over the community. Then in 94, another awful thing happens in the Houston area.
Another murder.
Yeah, this time it's a 23-year-old woman, Edwina Barnum, found murdered in her apartment. But again, the police hit a wall. Can't find any real leads. It's actually not until 2004, a full 10 years later, that Barnum's mother makes this, desperate plea for them to reopen the case.
Can you imagine losing your child and then having the case go cold for that long? Must be just agonizing.
Awful. And it doesn't stop there. Fast forward to the mid-2000s. 2 more brutal murders rock the Houston area. 28-year-old Danielle Subjects and 25-year-old Mandy Rubin.
So this is what, 4 murders now, all unsolved?
Yeah, and now there's a pattern emerging.
How so?
Both these women, they were raped, valuables were stolen from their homes, and crucially, DNA evidence was left at both crime scenes.
Ah, okay, so finally, maybe a way to connect the dots.
Exactly. 2006, 16 years after Kim Wildman's murder, guess who gets arrested?
McGregor.
Edward McGregor. The DNA finally links him to her murder scene.
16 years, though. That's a long time. And what was he doing all those years?
Well, that's the crazy part. He was living a seemingly normal life, working as a UPS delivery guy, no criminal record, just blending in.
A total double life, it sounds like.
Right. Makes you wonder who you can really trust. But hang on, didn't you say he was looked at for Wildman's murder back in the day? How'd he get off the hook and stay under the radar for so long?
Well, yeah, they investigated him, but they just didn't have enough back then to hold him. But now he's in jail for Wildman's murder, right? And investigators, they're starting to look at him for Subjects and Rubin, too. I mean, the similarities, his movements at the time, it all kind of lines up.
So they're thinking he could be responsible for all 4.
Exactly. But before they can really build those cases, something crazy happens. McGregor makes bail on the Wildman case. But then, a few months later, he gets arrested again. His DNA is matched to Edwina Barnum's murder from '94.
So now it's 2 murders they think he did.
2 confirmed, yeah. And then, while McGregor's back in jail, there's this really chilling incident with a cellmate.
Oh, what happened?
This cellmate, Adam Osani, claims McGregor just blurts out a confession.
Wait, he confessed? In jail?
Yeah, apparently during an argument, he yells at Osani, "Bitch, I'll kill you like I did to those other 2 bitches."
Whoa, okay, that's pretty incriminating.
Yeah, it's a serious accusation for sure. We got to remember the context, right? Jailhouse confessions, they can be tricky. We'll get into that, but there's more. The police, they used cell phone records to link McGregor to Subjects and Rubin too. He'd called both women right before they died.
So we've got DNA, a possible confession, phone records. This is looking bad for McGregor.
It does, but remember, we're trying to understand the why here, right? Not just the what. And to do that, we got to look at the trial of Edward George McGregor. That took place in 2010, and that's where things get really, really interesting.
Okay, so 2010, Edward McGregor is on trial for the murder of Kim Wildman. I mean, from what we've heard, it sounds like they had a lot on him.
Yeah, the evidence did seem pretty strong at that point, but the trial itself, well, it had a few surprises in store. Remember, McGregor, he was still saying he didn't do it, and his lawyers, they fought hard to make people doubt what the prosecution was saying.
Yeah, okay, so let's break down this trial. What were the main points each side was making?
Well, the prosecution, they really leaned on the DNA evidence, that supposed jailhouse confession, and those phone records putting him near the victims. They were painting him as, a cold, calculated killer who'd been getting away with it for years.
And if I'm remembering right, they only actually went after him for Wildman's murder, right? Not the other three. What was that about?
That's right. Since McGregor was 17 when Wildman was killed, they couldn't go for the death penalty in that case, so they were pushing for life in prison instead.
Okay, so what about the defense? How do they try to, counter that whole narrative?
Well, their strategy was to try and poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued the DNA evidence was weak, kind of circumstantial, questioning how the samples were handled and interpreted, that sort of thing. And they tried to raise doubts about that confession in jail, too, suggesting maybe McGregor was just bragging or trying to scare his cellmate.
Did anyone else come forward to defend him?
Yeah, actually, his brother, Tesfa, he testified, said that the night Wildman was murdered, he and Edward were home playing video games. Tesfa claimed he fell asleep around 11 and later saw Edward come back into their room wearing the same clothes, no signs of a struggle or any blood.
So on the one hand, you've got the prosecution saying he's this calculated killer, and then you have his brother basically providing an alibi. How does two such different stories come out of the same case? It's confusing.
It happens a lot more than you might think, and it really shows how tough it can be to figure out what really happened in a courtroom. Memories are tricky, evidence can be seen in different ways, witnesses can be influenced. This case is a prime example of all that.
Okay, but didn't you say earlier that a witness claimed to have overheard McGregor confessing? Doesn't that seem pretty solid?
Yeah, a woman named Dolores Lee testified that back in 1990, she was living across from Kim Wildman, and she heard McGregor talking to himself, basically admitting he did it.
Wow, that would be huge. But you also mentioned something about conflicting testimonies. What happened there?
Here's where it gets wild. Dolores Lee, she later admitted that she'd made the whole story up. She didn't even live across from Wildman, and the reasons she gave for coming forward all those years later, they turned out to be false too.
Hold on, she lied under oath. That's got to be a huge blow to the prosecution, right?
You'd think so, right? It really makes you wonder how often stuff like this happens and what it means for getting justice. Witness testimony, it can be so powerful, but this case shows how sometimes it can be totally unreliable.
So with all this back and forth, all these conflicting stories, what did the jury do? Did they think he was guilty?
Well, even with the conflicting testimonies, the defense trying to poke holes in the DNA evidence, and then that whole thing with Dolores Lee lying, the jury, they still found Edward McGregor guilty of killing Kim Wildman. He got life in prison, minimum 15 years.
Wow, life in prison. But even with that verdict, there's still so much that just doesn't add up. What happened after the trial? Did McGregor try to keep fighting?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In 2016, him and his lawyers, they filed for a new trial, said that the shaky DNA evidence, those unreliable witnesses, and Lee's admitted lies, all that, it was enough reason to have another look at the case.
Sounds reasonable to me, given everything that happened. But did it work? Did he get that new trial?
Nope, they turned him down. But, and this is a big but, there's another twist in this whole story that makes you question everything all over again. In 2019, the lead prosecutor on McGregor's case, Elizabeth Exley, she got sanctioned for misconduct.
Wait, what? What did she do? This is getting more and more complicated.
Turns out she had talked to McGregor's cellites, including Adam Assani, the one who said he heard that confession, but she didn't tell the defense attorneys about it.
Isn't that like a huge rule you can't break? Don't prosecutors have to share everything with the defense?
Exactly. They have a legal and ethical duty to give the defense any evidence that could help prove the defendant innocent. Not doing that, it's a big deal.
So what was her excuse for keeping this a secret?
Exley, she said she was just trying to make sure a serial killer stayed locked up. Said that, yeah, she made a mistake, but McGregor still got a fair trial, which is why his appeals were denied.
But wouldn't hiding that kind of information automatically make the trial unfair? How can it be fair if they're keeping secrets?
That's the whole point a lot of legal experts bring up. They say that even if it's with good intentions, withholding evidence, it messes up the whole idea of a fair trial.
So now we're left with a lot of questions. Did McGregor even get a fair trial? How much can we really trust the evidence they used against him? And what does this whole thing with the prosecutor do to our faith in the justice system?
Yeah, big questions. This case really shows how hard it can be to get to the truth, especially cold cases where memories are fuzzy and evidence can be interpreted in so many ways.
Okay, so where does that leave us? McGregor's still in prison, saying he's innocent. But with the prosecutor getting in trouble and all these questions about the evidence, it feels like this whole thing is far from over.
You're right, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? It forces us to think about some uncomfortable truths about the justice system. There's no simple answers here.
Definitely a lot to chew on. We went from what seemed like an open and shut serial killer case to this deep dive into the legal system, what evidence even means, and what justice really is.
And that's not even all of it. In the last part of our deep dive, we'll talk about the bigger meaning of this case and look at some of the ethical problems it brings up. We'll also think about what this case might tell us about the future of criminal justice and how we keep searching for the truth.
All right, we're back. And gotta say, this whole deep dive into Edward George McGregor, it's been a wild one. Murders, the arrest, the trial, even what the prosecutor did. It's like the more we learn, the more questions we have.
That's how it goes with these complicated cases, right? They kind of shake up what we think about justice and make us really ask, what does it even mean to find the truth?
Yeah, exactly. So where do we even start trying to understand the bigger picture here? I mean, we're left with so much uncertainty. Did Edward McGregor really do it? Did the whole legal process actually get justice?
Those questions, they're still being debated today. Some people say, look, even with the prosecutor messing up in those questions about the evidence, the jury got it right. They say, based on what they knew back then, McGregor was guilty.
But then there's this part of me that just keeps thinking, it can't be that simple. You know, the different stories from witnesses, the DNA evidence being iffy, what the prosecutor did, it all just makes you doubt the whole thing.
You've hit on something important there. This case really shows how tricky it is to balance getting justice with protecting individual rights. We want the bad guys punished, but everyone deserves a fair trial, even when they're accused of something horrible.
It's such a fine line, and this case is like a textbook example of how hard that is to do in real life. So what about McGregor himself? I mean, he's serving life, but he still says he didn't do it. What can he even do at this point?
Honestly, it's unlikely he'll get a new trial based on what they already have. But you never know, right? Maybe new evidence will show up or someone will challenge what the prosecutor did and win. It's not impossible.
So this whole Edward George McGregor saga, it's not really over then?
Not necessarily. This case, it reminds us that seeking justice, it's not a one-time thing. It's a process. Sometimes it's less about finding the absolute truth and more about always checking the evidence, making sure the system is as fair as we can make it.
Makes you think, what if some new evidence did come out? How would that change how we see this whole case? And how do we, as a society, deal with the fact that the justice system, even though it tries to be fair, it makes mistakes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we want justice, but accept that sometimes, even with a guilty verdict, we may never know for sure? This deep dive, it hasn't given us easy answers, but it's definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has. We went from what seemed like a clear-cut serial killer case to, well, a much deeper look at the legal system, what evidence even is, and what justice really means. This one will stick with me.
And that's what's great about these dives, right? They can change how we see things, hopefully for the better.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, if this has sparked your interest, I mean, really got you thinking, go do some more digging on your own. Read up on it, form your own opinions. We've only scratched the surface here.
And remember what we've learned today, how important it is to really look at the evidence, and that we all have a part to play in finding truth and justice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us as we explored this really fascinating, thought-provoking case. Until next time, keep those minds curious and never stop questioning. It says 1880 place.